His name was Thomas Oakes. He was born 1776, I believe, and into Ellestone, Staffordshire, England. It was a woolen mill town. His father was a miller. His grandparents were all millers. But when he was 4 years old, and he had an older brother, David, who was 2 years older, his father rescued two boys from a mill pond and caught pneumonia and died. His mother eventually remarried and had other children. And it's possible the older brother went to London to live with relatives, but that's not verified. When he was 7 to 14 years old, he was an apprentice seaman. And when it came time to decide to continue or not, he decided not to, but so he went back to Ellestone and probably didn't fit in too well. So somehow ended up in London, we don't know how. And he was taught by a man named Thomas Keith, who was a math teacher and private tutor. We don't know how he paid for that or how that worked out, but that's what happened. When he was about 25, he decided to come to the United States. He met with his brother, and they agreed to name each other's first son after each other. And he parted ways. Oh, he had to have a profession to get a ticket to the United States. So he went back to Ellestone, worked in the mill for 3 months, got a certificate saying he was a miller. And then he came to the United States on a freighter and landed in Philadelphia. He met up with another Englishman, Drury Bromley, and they traveled up and down the East Coast, fixing and building mills. And they went as far south as Maryland, far north as Rhode Island, but primarily worked in the Pennsylvania area. And I know they worked on the Brandywine mills. Mr. Bromley met a young lady in Bloomfield, Maria Cadmus, and decided to marry and settle down. So that's how Thomas Oakes ended up in Bloomfield. And then when they were working on the Kingsland mill, he met Rachel, who was, I think, the 7th of 10 children, very young at the time. But when they married, she was 18, he was 32. So he moved into the Kingsland Manor with her, and that's where David, their first son, was born. He built a house at 731 Bloomfield Avenue, and he and Mr. Bromley had owned a lot of property together and had a mill and their 2 houses. And then eventually he was asked to go to Pennsylvania to supervise or to be head engineer for the Schuylkill Canal, which he did do. And he and Mr. Bromley tried to dissolve the partnership, but when Thomas Oakes died of fever there, the partnership really had not been dissolved. In the canal, there's an area called the Oakes Reach, which is a long stretch of the canal, which was named for him. And there were 3 canal boats that went up and down the canal when it was finished. And one of them was named the Thomas Oakes. Rachel, his wife, didn't come back to Bloomfield until that fall. And it's believed most likely her brother, another Joseph Kingsland, came out and helped her do that. And they probably waited for the baby to be about 4 months old, because it was only 2 months old when her father died. They came back to Bloomfield. They had to hire a lawyer because all the property that was owned with Mr. Bromley went in his name. They did end up with the homestead. And I know Joseph Kingsland accompanied Rachel to Newark to register the death of Thomas Oakes in New Jersey. He was buried in Pennsylvania. We know that. But what happened after that, we don't know. The cemetery was moved, a church was built over the cemetery, so now there's no record of it. And there is a tombstone in the Bloomfield Cemetery but there's a good chance he's not buried there. Her father was Joseph Kingsland. Her mother was Mary Outwater. And they were basically Tories and flew to Newfoundland at that time. And then came back to New York City and used their land in New Jersey for lumber to use for sidewalks and curbs in New York City. First Thomas, he named his second son, Joseph Kingsland Oakes, and his last daughter was Mary, or Mary Outwater. And the other two, John and Sarah, were his parents. I don't know a lot of the details. I know he built the house on 240. I know he started the mill, and I know it burned down at one point and he had to start over again. And he experimented with different kinds of material and treatments and procedures, and kept building and building. Acquired a lot of property, I'm not sure how, but around the mill. And he used it to help the people who worked at the mill. In other words, he sold off lots so they could build houses, or he built houses and had them buy it, or he took back mortgages or gave them loans. And he did all kinds of things like that. He also, both he and his son Thomas, helped establish different churches in town, so different clubs, different organizations, so that all the people who worked in the mill could continue their life the way they wanted to live. He also sponsored people to come over from Europe, those who needed to have a job to come to when they before they left their country. His first wife was Abigail Harrison Baldwin, and they had 3 children, Sarah, George, and Thomas. And Sarah married Cornelius Van Loo and had a daughter, Helen, but then she died at 24 years old. But Helen was raised in the household at 249. And I should explain, that house was 249 Belleville Avenue, was called Oakeside. And it was spelled Oakside. And then 240 across the street, we all called 240. And then when my father established his farm, Oakeside Farm, he asked my Aunt Eleanor to register the name, and she put the E in the middle. So Oakeside Farm has the E in the middle. But now that 240 is being called Oakeside, as a family, we're starting to call what we called Oakeside 249, just to avoid confusion. His second child was George, and George worked for the mill, but also married, had a daughter, but died also very young. So Thomas was the one who grew up to run the mill. And he built a house actually on Belleville Avenue 206. I don't know if I think he built it, but it was on property owned by his father. So 2 weeks before his father remarried, that property was put in his name, so it would not be involved in another estate. The second wife was Elizabeth Spear, who was a lady from Bloomfield. And they were married about 2 years before David died. And she was asked to leave the house. And she owned some property which was bought from her. And my grandfather, the story is my grandfather escorted her to either the train or the boat dock when she left, but I think he may have accompanied his father because he was very young at the time. And she moved to South Carolina, where she had a married sister who was a teacher, and she lived there until she died in 1915. And the interesting, funny thing about her is when my grandmother was telling me about her, she couldn't remember her name, but she was holding a broken plate that had been mended. And she said, she was the one who broke the plate. So for years, I knew her as the one who broke the plate. Thomas moved back into the house and renovated it and made it much larger than it was. He added a whole third story and a little tower on the top and made it Italianate. During the Civil War, they produced a lot of the blue blankets and the blue uniform cloth for the Union soldiers. And I do know that a scrapbook was put together of all the letters and contracts that were negotiated between the mill and the Abraham Lincoln government at the time. And my Aunt Jean had this scrapbook, and she brought it to Bloomfield one time for an event where they wanted to display it for people to see. And when she went to retrieve it to take it back home, it was gone. So I'd like to just say, if this appears anywhere, and I hope it ends up with a historical society, I'd love to know about it, and the family would love to just see it, because we've heard about it but have never seen it. So, but yeah, the bill was very much involved in the Civil War. Thomas married Juliet Guion Maxfield, who was a Bloomfield native. And she came from a large family, mostly boys, who were all in their early 20s at that point. And their reputation around town was not wonderful. Of course, they eventually mostly became doctors, but in their 20s, they were not great citizens of the town. So she tried to distance herself from the family, and she tried to drop the name Maxfield from her name. So she was known as Juliet Guion Oakes, or JGO, and she just pretended she wasn't part of that family as much as she could. She was very socially conscious, and she was determined that her children would not marry someone that she did not approve of. So this made it very difficult for all three children. Cornelius Van Loo was involved in the Morris Canal, so he traveled quite a bit. So their daughter, Helen, was raised at 249 Belleville Avenue with Thomas and his children. So she was a cousin to my grandfather, David, but raised like a sister. She eventually married Harry Richards, who we've referred to in the family as the man with the 5 degrees. He had a medical degree, a law degree, and several religious degrees. And they actually lived at 249 also for a while before they moved to Franklin Avenue. And they lived on 2 houses on Franklin. They never had children, but my aunts and my father were often invited to their house for Sunday dinners, and that's where they had to practice their very best manners and learned all the proper things to do and even say or not say. There also was a room in the house where they kept things that could be used in little skits and plays, and sometimes they did that and put on little performances for their adults. Cornelius Van Loo was concerned about the health of his second wife and his daughter, and he wanted a warm place to spend the winter. So he bought Ellington, which was a plantation near Doswell, just north of Richmond, Virginia. And Nell, we called her cousin Nell. She spent a lot of her winters down there. And her father and his second wife never had children of their own. So she inherited that plantation from him. And she continued to invite friends and family from Bloomfield down there. And she gave little parties and receptions. And that's how my grandfather met my grandmother. He attended the Newark Academy, and he loved bicycle riding, and he rode the very large bicycles with a huge front wheel and a tiny back wheel, and actually won awards in different races for that. He loved working with wood, very tiny carvings, inlays, which are called marquetry. And later on, he got one of the first automobiles, I guess, in Bloomfield, and was a member of the New Jersey Auto Club and took trips where they kept records of the condition of the roads and where they could stay, have lunch or spend the night and those kinds of things. He also had 2 violins and a banjo. I don't know too much about how they were used or where he played them, but he had them and he used them. He smoked cigars, I know that, and he was very much a gentleman. He loved his glass of scotch every night. I have one memory of him, which is kind of funny. Apparently, I was about 4 years old and sitting at the dining room table, and he was at the head, which is where the windows were. My grandmother was at the other end, and he started to sneeze. He excused himself and went out in the hall and continued sneezing. And as a child, I just remembered this. And it's funny because my brother does the same thing. When he starts to sneeze, he sneezes 13 times. So it's a little genetic trait that came down. And they both have the same name, which is kind of funny. Cousin Nell is the one responsible for them getting together. She, I think, engineered the whole thing. She knew that his mother would not accept anybody that she, had to be the right kind of person. So she engineered this meeting between my grandfather and my grandmother. But my grandmother had an older sister who really was the intended one. And my grandmother had a boyfriend at the time, and the assumption was that she would marry him. But my grandfather liked her and pursued her and said he would wait until she was 21 years old. I think she was about 18. And so he waited quite a while. And then finally he sent her a telegram and said, "I can't wait any longer. I'm coming down. I want your answer." So she had to think very hard what she was going to do. This was a tremendous decision for her. She'd probably never been out of Virginia. And the idea of leaving her family and moving north with a Yankee, particularly an older man, was quite a huge decision. And I remember she said she was embroidering edges on handkerchiefs during all this time where she was thinking about what she should do. And she finally decided she was going to do it. And she put a white flag on her buggy whip and rode to the train station to pick him up with the white flag flying. And that flag has been preserved. Not so much the difference between ages, but it was the difference between country versus sophisticated town life. There was one story of, to her, you called the butcher, well, in her day, you didn't call the butcher, but fresh meat was killed on the farm and you ate it very quickly. So when she moved to Bloomfield, she'd call the butcher and ask for fresh meat to be delivered. And my grandfather would call the butcher and say, whenever Mrs. Oakes orders fresh beef, please give her aged beef. And so there were little things like that, which she had to learn. Well, Cousin Nell, of course, was very much involved. And in that day, you made all your own clothes. So she helped them buy the material for the different clothes. And my grandmother and her sister and her mother all got together and made everything. And then I know there was a car for a train that was reserved for the wedding party from Bloomfield. They all came down in one train car. And it was in January. Don't ask me why, but it was in January. And so they got married. And my grandmother had a beautiful gown, which was also used by her sister when she got married. Of course, in those days, you reused everything as much as you could. But then every 5 years, they dressed up in their wedding finery and had a little party or whatever. And my grandmother kept a scrapbook. She was a big scrapbooker. She, every 5 years, she recorded in the scrapbook where they were, what they did, who they were with. And even after my grandfather died, she continued to do this. It's a very nice book to look at. Her grandfather was Thomas Walker Doswell, and he and his father, Thomas Doswell, lived at Bloomfield and were involved in racehorses, breeding, and training of horses. And their claim to fame is a horse named Planet, who was inducted into the Saratoga Racing Hall of Fame. Then after the Civil War, my great-great-grandfather died, and Bloomfield had to be sold. But they sectioned off a portion of it, which was called Hildene, and that belonged to my grandmother's father, and that's where she grew up. And he continued with the horse racing, but of course after the Civil War, it wasn't the same, and he didn't have the success his father and grandfather had. Eventually, he ended up working for the railroad and had to sell Hildene, and they moved to Ashland, which is a small town there. And by that time, my grandmother was married and her sister was married. So the two families got together and built a house for them in Ashland. And then when my great-grandfather died, my great aunt Anne, my grandmother's sister, moved into that house, and she and her family continued to live in that house. And then her daughter lived in that house. So I was very familiar with that house. And when you walked in, there were portraits on the walls, huge portraits of the great-great-grandparents and the great-great-great-grandparents. So it was always a fun house to visit. After my grandparents got married, they came back from their honeymoon to 249 Belleville Avenue. And my grandfather's mother said to my grandfather, "Your room is ready, and the guest room is ready for Jean." And of course, he said, "No, that's not going to be the way it is." So they renovated 240. So they didn't move in right away, but they did. And they had 4 children. And my Aunt Eleanor was first born in 1911, and Aunt Juliet in 1912. Now, Aunt Eleanor, I always considered her the elegant one. none of them looked, well, they sort of looked alike, but they really didn't look like they came from the same parents. And it's funny because my brother, sister, and I stand together and nobody would think we're related. There just isn't that thing in the family. Anyway, Aunt Eleanor was sickly as a child, and she actually lost a year of school. So she ended up in the same grade as Aunt Juliet. And they went through school together and were often called twins. And not only because they were the same class together, but my grandmother sewed their clothes and made their clothes so they were the same, where sometimes she hired a local seamstress. So they looked like twins. They both went through Sweetbriar, Sweetbriar Academy, which was a 2-year school at that point. Then my Aunt Eleanor met on a cruise, James Skinner, which became her husband, and they lived in Philadelphia. Juliet married 2 years later, Jack Eels, who was an English professor, and they lived in Wisconsin, California, and South Carolina. So they didn't always come home for Christmas. I should say, when Aunt Eleanor got married, it was the same weekend that her Aunt Mary, who was at 249 Double Avenue, died of pneumonia. And my Aunt Eleanor actually put on her whole wedding dress and walked across the street to 249 to show her Aunt Mary what she looked like as a bride. Then there's my Aunt Jean, who was born in 1915. And she went through school. She went through Sweetbriar also, which I think was 4 years at that time. And she wanted to be a doctor. But it was war years, and she was told that if she took a seat in a medical school, she would be denying a man an exemption from the war. So it wasn't a thing for her to do, but she did figure out how to be a pharmacist. I don't know how that worked, but she became a pharmacist, and she moved out of 240 to Red Bank, had her own little house, and she was 87 years old when her drugstore was bought out by a chain and they let everybody go. And she actually went around town and applied to other drugstores to be a pharmacist. Of course, nobody hired her, so she officially retired. She was engaged to be married at one point, but decided to break it off because she didn't want to lose her independence. And I think she was content with that decision throughout her life. But every once in a while, she had some regret, but not enough to be upset. Then there was my father, Thomas, who was born in 1918. And he had an incredible life in Bloomfield because he was the son of the boss of the mill. He was able to do a lot of things. He loved to build things. He built go-karts, and one after the other, all with different sources of power. And if he needed to figure out something, he could go to the mill, and there was a woodworking shop, there was a metal shop, there was a plumbing shop, there was this shop and that shop. And the people who worked there would answer any question he had and show him how to do things and let him use tools. And so he gathered himself an incredible education. He didn't like school. So as time went on, his parents decided to put him in Stevens Institute for 2 years to prepare him for college. And he figured out that he could graduate in 1 year. So he came home the day before graduation and said, "I'm graduating tomorrow." So his parents didn't have too much they could do. But there was a big meeting with Uncle George involved and trying to decide whether he should go to college or what should happen. He didn't want to go to college, and he said if he did, he'd be studying engineering, and he really didn't need that because anything that he would be taught, he already knew. So what he wanted to do was to take what money was available and buy an airplane. And eventually that's what happened. it was decided he was not going to continue on with the mill. Then when my father got married, it was assumed that my mother would move into 240. And she said no, she was not going to do that. So the only thing my father had was a hunting lodge out in New Jersey. So that's where they went. And I've been to this it's a little cabin. And it's interesting because the bathroom is an exact duplicate of one at 240. And I know my father was involved in building it, because I know he did the electricity for the whole thing. So that's interesting. And he became a pilot for Eastern Airlines, and that's then we go into my life. But those are the children of my grandparents. Of course, there was a big piano in the music room, and they all learned to play the piano. My father played the trumpet, and my grandfather had the violins and the banjo. And I don't remember my grandmother actually playing anything. Her big love was the flowers, the gardens. And of course, she had the big garden at the back of the house, the rose garden and the fish pond. And there was a kitchen garden behind the kitchen. And she loved her gardeners and the garden. That was a big thing each spring, to plan out what she was going to plant where. She also loved genealogy. And in the music room, she had prepared huge scrapbooks one was all the pictures of ancestors that she could find. And then the second one was all pictures of houses and churches, and even ministers and doctors that were involved with the family. She also had one whole page with what she called her helpers, which were the gardeners, the cooks, the chauffeurs, and all of their pictures and dates. And she was very proud of all that and worked hard on that. She loved scrapbooks. Every couple of years was one scrapbook. But after her children were married, she started just putting a whole newspaper in the scrapbook. So someday I'll have to go through those and figure out what each one was for to complete the series. But she did a marvelous job with all that. And that's all been preserved. She was a part of a lot of local organizations, the Red Cross and the Garden Club and the this, that, and the other thing. And I know she always had beautiful flowers on all the tables every time she had a party. And I have her favorite flower vase, which is green glass, very tall, very large, and it only takes very large flowers. And I know she put it on the newel post at the bottom of the stairs. And I always marvel that it still exists. It didn't get knocked off and broken, and I don't know why. And I hope I'm not the one to break it. I did read somewhere where she had a garden party with 58 tables. I can't imagine how that worked out. I do know she had multiple green tablecloths, and I know she had a lot of depression glass, at least 24 of everything. So I just assumed that was kind of the size of her garden parties, but they must have been much larger than that also. Yes, there were very much traditions that we had to follow exactly. And I should say my Aunt Eleanor had two daughters. Aunt Juliet had a son and daughter. And of course, my father had me, my sister, and brother. So there were 7 of us. And we all gathered for Christmas at 240 the night before. And we were always the last ones there because we were closest, I guess, or because my father had to work, I'm not sure. But the tree would always be up, and it was in the music room in front of the fireplace. And there was a table set in the music room also for the grandchildren, the 7 of us. And the adults would be in the dining room, around the dining room table. And the menu was squab. A squab is small chicken-like bird, which was grown at 240 in the chicken coop behind the garage. And we, of course, had to dress for dinner, long dresses and jackets for the men. And you had to eat this with knife and fork. You weren't allowed to pick anything up. So we always considered this our little trial that we had to go through before we got to Christmas. But this is how we greeted our cousins each year, because we usually hadn't seen them usually for as much as a year. Then when it came time to prepare for Santa Claus, we all had to change clothes and get into our robes and things. And we had to sit in front of the fireplace, and someone had to read "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," which we did. And then we all dutifully went off to bed. And there was a gate at the top of the stairs that had to be closed. And we all went to bed. Now, somewhere in the middle of the night, you'd hear sleigh bells that somebody would ring. And then in the morning, we, of course, got up, got dressed, went downstairs. The big sliding doors would be all closed. There would be a silver tray with orange juice on the side table, which we could have. And we had to wait in the foyer until all the adults got dressed and came down to welcome Santa Claus. And sometimes it was a long wait, but we waited. And then when we were all together, we tooted some horns to make sure Santa Claus knew we were coming. And the doors were opened, and we were allowed to go in and see what Santa Claus brought us. Now, our stockings were literally white stockings that your great-grandmother might have worn. And each one had a piece of yarn on the toe with a different color, so we knew which belonged to who. And we would enjoy our Christmas presents and then go into what we called the garden room to have Christmas breakfast, which was a long table set with a Yule log and ivory birds all around the edge. And the menu was lamb chops, parsley potatoes, and hard rolls, which we loved. And in fact, many of us keep that tradition alive even now. So then we'd go into the music room, which is where all the presents had been piled up under the tree, which was pretty big pile because there were so many families. And my Uncle Jimmy and my father would distribute the presents. And one thing that always made us a little sad, my grandmother would always pile up her presents in the corner, and she would not open them while we were there. And as grandchildren, it was always so hard to figure out what to give Grandma for Christmas. And but she would not open them while we were there. And of course, in retrospect, it was because she didn't want to show favorites, I'm sure. I called my grandmother Grandma, but my cousins called her Grand Missy because she was the Grand Mrs. And they called my mother Aunt Jean, and they called what I called my Aunt Jean, they called her Aunt Butch. Don't ask me why, I don't know. That's the way it was. So then we played with our toys and things during the afternoon, and on the big table in the living room was always a big basket of fruit sent up by the Virginia relatives, along with a Virginia ham and beaten biscuits and pound cake. That was very traditional every year. And they would send greens to put on the mantelpiece. And one year in the greens for the mantelpiece was a praying mantis nest, which of course hatched, and we had praying mantises all over the living room. So then we dressed for dinner, long dresses for the girls, jackets for the men. And we had dinner was served buffet style around the dining room table. And we had a turkey at each end, one with chestnut stuffing and one with oyster stuffing, with the usual things to go with it. And we ate in the garden room. And there was plum pudding for dessert with hard sauce. Then we left. Sometimes we spend the night, leave the next morning. We always brought our collie with us, a dog with a big red bow. He would walk around, everybody would pet him. So it was a lot of fun. George was he was a vice president at the mill. My grandfather was president. I don't know why that was the way it was, but it was. He had actually a college degree from Rutgers of chemistry. And so he considered himself oftentimes on official things as electrician for the mill, which doesn't make a lot of sense. But anyway, he also was a big fisherman and loved to go on long fishing trips and to exotic places. But early on, he met a local woman named Bessie May Firing, and he became engaged to her. And they had a fairly long engagement because I know she was invited to Ellington several times, and she was an artist. She drew several pictures of Ellington, which have been preserved in the family. She was a beautiful woman, very talented. I think she played the violin or something of that sort also. But she and her mother went to Europe to obtain a trousseau for the wedding. And on the way back, the ship it crashed into the shores of Ireland, and most of the people on the ship were killed, including the two of them. So George and his Bessie's father hurried to Ireland as quickly as they could, retrieved the bodies and brought them back to Bloomfield. And then years later, the cottage where the people lived who took care of them was torn down, and they found a thank you note that George had written. And it was sent back to Bloomfield for some reason and delivered to my grandmother. And I don't know where that is, but I've just heard about it. And then years later after that, many years later, a young woman stopped at the door, and my grandmother answered, and she showed her a beautiful diamond ring that she said this was the ring that George had given Bessie May, and it had come down in the family, and now she was engaged to one of the, I think, nephews. So that's all very interesting, and life for the Oakes family would have been very different if she had not died. So then many years later, he met a woman who named Madeline Perry, who his mother did not approve of. So she lived in New York, and he basically went to New York every weekend. He was a life member of the New York Athletic Society. They just basically had a relationship that was not in Bloomfield. And eventually, after his mother died, they did marry. And it was announced to the family that they had had a child together who probably was close to being an adult at that point. But no one had ever met this child. It is just a fact that's hanging out there. Well, Madeline finally moved into 249 Belleville Avenue after Juliet died, and she redecorated it, decided she still didn't like it, and so that's when the house was sold. And they moved away, and he died. The mill was sold, and then he died not too long after that. The one, of course, I knew best was Maddie, who was the maid. And I know in census records, it looks like she lived there, but in all my lifetime, she always just came and went. She didn't live there. But she was wonderful, and she would cook your favorite meal if you were there by yourself, which was always fun. Mine was spoon bread. And she also was famous for making the best ice cream, homemade ice cream. She would make chocolate, vanilla, or peach. Now, her mother was Aunt Carrie, who had been hired by my grandmother as a laundress early on in their marriage. And it was often said that she came from Virginia with her, but that's not true. Aunt Carrie came to New Jersey from Virginia many years before my grandmother had come there. One interesting thing about Maddie is she didn't believe in germs. You couldn't see germs, so that in her mind, they didn't exist. And one little thing that has come down the family. My father was running around doing something one day, and she stopped and she said, "Master Tom, you're a jackass of all trades." So she loved us all, and we loved her. Then John Wesley Meade was sort of somebody who sort of came and went. He was like a butler, chauffeur, whatever was needed by anybody. And he kind of just appeared when they needed help, maybe with extra company or extra whatever. So I didn't see too much of him, but he seemed to be a wonderful man. So also I wanted to say there was before the Garden State Park we went through, there was a tennis court behind the chicken coop, and it was a clay tennis court, which apparently my father had to maintain at different times. And as an adult, I never saw him express any interest in tennis or ever play tennis. So apparently that was all he wanted as far as tennis. My grandmother to me always represented permanence. Everything was always the same when you went there. She was always the same. Maddie was always the same. The house was always the same. Nothing changed, which was very comforting to a child. And my grandmother was never sick. I never saw her angry with anyone. She just was an amazing person in retrospect. One thing the grandchildren found out many years later after we started talking to one another was that each one of us had introduced our prospective spouses to her prior to making any other announcing publicly. So, and my story is a little funny because I was staying at my grandmother's house taking a course at Rutgers one summer. So my boyfriend at the time came to visit me there, and he met my grandmother. Now, the purpose of his coming to meet me there was to let me know that he had plans for his life, and it didn't involve a serious relationship with a woman at that time. So, but he met my grandmother, and we ended up sitting in the kitchen, and she told him how wonderful this decision was he made, and how his parents did the right thing. She just poured on the Southern charm like you wouldn't believe. It was marvelous to see. We excused ourselves and went for a walk in the big garden, and he proceeded to tell me all his plans for his life and how it didn't involve a relationship with a woman at that point. And he went through all the reasons and finally finished, and I said, "No, you're not going to do this." And he said, "Okay." And in retrospect, it was all my grandmother's fault. So we laugh about that a lot. I think the Oakes family, and something I haven't mentioned, is all of them were very, very involved in all the local organizations, all the things that they could do to improve Bloomfield and make it better for everybody. They did it. They were on bank boards and hospital boards and this club and that club. They did their best to improve their town. They loved their town. And that always has impressed me as an adult, that they devoted so much time to all that. As far as the house goes, I'm hoping it will be preserved. I'm hoping that people respect the history and the family that lived there. And I hope they enjoy it, really, really enjoy every part of it. When you walked in the front door, beautiful front door, big foyer, beautiful staircase. There was an organ at the foot of the stairs, and the bathroom hallway, and the piece of furniture where you hang your clothes that had a mirror and everything. But then in the living room, it was a large room, and in one corner where all the windows were was a big black leather tufted couch on an angle, and behind that couch were all kids' toys. And it was a big enough space back there. If you were a kid, you could go back and play behind the couch. In front of the fireplace was my grandfather's big black chair, my grandmother's chair, and her sewing chest, and the little table with the Indian African animal legs. And then at the far end of the living room was a big heavy table. But then when my grandfather was dying, that table was removed and a bed was put there so he could be taken care of there. By the fireplace, there was a little table and a telephone. And on either side of the fireplace were storage cabinets, which were hidden in the woodwork and had little latches at the top to open them. And people often wondered what were in those storage areas. Well, I can tell you, the one on the right had Christmas decorations. The one on the left had copies of National Geographic. And there was a back door that took you out into the hall and the bathroom, and there was a little dining room behind. And then across the hall was, from the living room, was the music room, which of course had a big piano in it and had a desk. And in the corner, across from the fireplace, was a table with a lamp, which held the huge scrapbooks that I was telling you about before. They were all there all together, with my grandfather's violins underneath. The dining room had, of course, the big picture of the lion at one end, a big mirror, the big dining room table and chairs, little tea set at the end. And then there was a door to the garden room. We called it the garden room. I know you call it the solarium, which was added onto the house later. I think when one of my grandmother's parents died, she inherited a little money and she built this. And it was a beautiful room, it really was. The center was basically built as a dance floor, big wide boards with stone all around the edge, with porch type furniture and lots of birdhouses. And there was lots of plants, of course, and there was a skylight at the end and a fountain. And lots of times the vines and things would grow all over it. You could barely see that there was a fountain there. And sometimes it would be pulled back and then it would grow again. But I've heard stories about them shutting the doors to the house and letting the birds fly around. But the doors to the outside, of course, had screens, so they would open the doors and let the air in. And every once in a while, at least once, the bird would sit on top of the door. And if somebody closed the door, it would have gotten crushed. There was a tree planted outside there that was planted when my father was born. I don't think it's there anymore, but it was there. That's the first. The kitchen was, first of all, you walk through a butler's pantry to get to the kitchen, and everything was white. And they had I think it's a marble table, and that's where everybody was born. And my grandmother had a steamer on top of the stove where she steamed her rolls, because to her, a meal was not a meal unless you had bread. And she could do that. She wasn't a cook. She's notorious for starting something and walking out of the kitchen. And she also had a telephone between two doorways in the kitchen, which just fit this like 4x4 inch little space. And it fit the telephone on the stand with the receiver on the hook. And she would not give up that phone. And finally, the phone company figured out a way to put a dial on the bottom so she could at least dial a number with it. But she wanted it to fit in that little corner. The clock behind me was on the wall in the kitchen. And there also was one like it in the basement. The refrigerator was in a separate little room outside the kitchen. And then there were stairs down to the outside. And the kitchen, garden, and laundry area was behind. That's the first floor. love the staircase. The landings were wonderful because they had little bookcases with windows above. And in these bookcases were all kinds of family heirlooms or fun things to look at. I know on the first landing, there used to be a shingle from Bloomfield that had a bullet from the Civil War in it. And there were, what do you call it, stirrups from one of the famous horses. And on the landing, there was a little table with a horse trophy. And so it was always fun to look at all this stuff. The master bedroom, of course, was in the front of the house. It had the big bay windows and had twin beds, a big dresser, chairs, and chest of drawers. And then behind was the dressing room, which had my grandfather's chiffreau. It had a big chest of drawers and a nook. Under glass was where my grandmother kept all her special invitations, cards, poems, things of that sort. And then after she died, somebody took all that out and put it into a scrapbook. There also was a chaise lounge, a closet, and a desk. And then the bathroom, which had a bidet. But to me, that, you know, every bathroom that your grandmother had a bidet. I didn't think it was anything unusual. And beyond the bathroom was the sleeping porch, which is where most people were put if they were sick and needed to recover or something. And I know my father was put there when he had polio. And that was a big deal for the family because, and they even imported a doctor from New York who apparently gave him a spinal tap. I'm not sure that cured him, but he did survive with no ill effects. He also broke his leg, did a few other things. But that's where you were put if you were sick. And the funny thing about that was added later, apparently. And whoever designed it didn't want to move the cement walk that was down below. So they made it just the right width to fit the bed, but no more. So whoever makes the bed thinks about the man who made that decision, because you can't walk around the bed to make it. Next to the master bedroom was a small study, which really was a study for my aunts. Well, it was a nursery at first, and then a study for my aunts. It had a double desk and a single desk in there. And then when the mill was sold, my grandfather's huge roll top desk was brought up there. And so that was always a study of some sort. Next to that was a large room similar to the master, which is where my three aunts lived. And it was all white wicker furniture, brass beds and white wicker furniture. And then there was a bathroom, and then behind that was a sort of a nice guest room, bedroom, which I considered a guest room because it never really was assigned to anybody. And then there was another bathroom and my father's room. My father's room had a chiffreau, a desk and a bed and a little table and chair. And the interesting thing about that was on the wall were pictures of Charles Lindbergh and the Spirit of St. Louis. And on his chiffreau were pictures of his girlfriends. And when he got married and left home, those pictures stayed there. And one time we asked my grandmother, why are the pictures still there? And she said, well, if he ever comes back, his room is ready for him. So anyway, behind his room was the sewing room, which got used a lot. And then the back stairs down to the kitchen. And this is a funny little story. There were closets everywhere, and inside the closets were light bulbs. And when I was in high school, I had a science project where I did a study of old light bulbs. So I went and took all my grandmother's very old light bulbs and used them for this project. And unfortunately, somebody saw this basket of light bulbs I had and thought they were trash and threw them out. So then I had to go back and scrounge some more light bulbs, but I didn't have enough to do justice to the project. So that was just an interesting little thing. So the old light bulbs are no longer there. Okay, that pretty much covers the second floor. going up to the third floor, there was another landing, another windows, another place for family heirlooms to be displayed. So that was always fun. And then there was a telephone system, or a calling system, shall we say, that you could call different rooms down to the kitchen or wherever. So that was always fun. And then there was a really nice guest room, the top front, which probably was used by, you would think a couple. It was big enough for a couple because it had little nooks for studying and chairs, and it had a sink. But probably a nurse or a nanny or whoever had to live in probably was there. And then there was a little hallway and a bathroom and another bedroom under the eaves, was smaller. And then there was what we call the playroom, which had a lot of closets. And of course, there was a sink in one of the closets, and one section had been set up as a projector where we could show movies, and had little sliding doors where the lens peeked out and all that kind of stuff. There was a piano in there, fireplace, and the old Victrola was in there. And the attic entrance was in there. It was a wonderful walk-in attic with huge cedar chests just lining the sides. It was an attic I would love to have someday. Anyway, it was a fun place to play. There were dolls and tables and just fun things. The basement was a place where the laundry was. That's when you went down the stairs, it was the laundry area. And then as you went back through, there was a huge cigar humidor that my grandfather had. And I know there was a locked room where he kept probably liquor and other things. And but there's apparently a story that there was a secret vault under the garden room. I don't think there was, but there was a room that he kept locked. I did hear that it was raided during Prohibition, but they didn't find anything. I don't know why they didn't find anything, but they didn't. So it was divided up into several rooms. There was kind of a workshop area and other type areas. There was a maid's room, which was elevated a little bit, I guess to keep it off the damp floor, but it had no windows. So it wasn't a very nice room, but it was apparently dry and comfortable. And apparently that was where Maddie stayed when she had to spend the night, but I never got the feeling she lived there. So, that was the basement. And then what you call the carriage house or the garage originally was a stable. And the left side was the tack room. And then, of course, it got converted to a garage for the cars. And then above the garage was an apartment, or half of it was an apartment. And that's where a valet or chauffeur or whoever was possibly living there to help with the house. That's would be his apartment. But also up in the storage half of that was where my grandmother kept her side saddle and supposedly her Confederate flag, although I never actually saw it. So, and then behind the garage was the chicken coop, and behind that was the tennis court. Oh, then there was my father's playhouse, which he built. And as grandchildren, we played in that. It was a little 2-room with a porch playhouse. And he also had a tiny, tiny little garage for his racing car. One of my favorite memories is going down there with 2 friends of mine and just playing around the house. And my grandmother, for some reason, let us open up a trunk of old clothes and let us try them on. Now, we were like 12, 13, 14 years old, so we were tall and thin, and these dresses fit us. They were like 1860, 1870 dresses, probably belonging to Sarah Oakes Van Loo. And so they had very tiny waists, very tiny wrists, but big skirts. And big sleeves. And we paraded around the garden pretending we were ladies. And actually somebody took some pictures so that we have that, which it was so fun to dress up. And I didn't realize how precious that was, of course, until years later. But we actually fit into those dresses and now realize how small these people really were. Of course, my father's playhouse was there, and that was always fun to bring friends to the playhouse. It was a little double room house. It was fun. And just being at my grandmother's house was fun. Friends of mine still talk about it and remember their days there and how much fun we had. So that was great.